Give this about 30 to 45 seconds to fill up a bit. You can see the number just go.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, 103, 109, 113. Yeah.
I had to go grab myself some coffee, not to imply anything about your last talk at all.
Yeah,
More
you
about
fell asleep. I saw
conference
it.
planning. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back for those of you that were just with us with Paul for an hour and 15 minutes a little bit ago. And if you were not with us earlier, you are in for a treat because we are having the opportunity to listen to Paul Carey talk about what he knows about. He definitely knows his stuff, and it's pretty evident. As I mentioned before, I'm not doing bios necessarily so that we can get into content. The bio is in the speaker session. You can read how extremely qualified he is to give his presentation today if you would like to go read that. But otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to him so that he can give his presentation on emerging drug trends.
Thank you, Marie. Good afternoon again, Tennessee. As Marie said, you can go read my bio, but I need to tell you that my bio was written by my mother, so you can't believe a word of it anyway. And she's really biased. So good afternoon. I'm broadcasting this afternoon from my home in beautiful Columbia, Missouri, where it's a very nice day out here, partly cloudy, and with a temperature of about 67 degrees. I thank all of you for joining me this afternoon. I really appreciate your attendance, and in return, I hope to give you some useful information. So if everybody's ready, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking in this session about emerging drug trends, and to be honest, I have to give you a caveat here because in talking about this subject matter, the downside is that with all of the emerging trends and all of the new drugs and all the things that are coming into this country, mostly from foreign lands, and maybe a lot of them you can't test for, and on and on and on, you're going to get really depressed. So I'm glad that we're starting this session at 2:45 in the afternoon. We're going to get done about 4. It's going to be very close to happy hour. So at that point, maybe you can decide, oh yeah, I really, after listening to Paul talk about emerging drug trends, I need to get an adult beverage because I'm so depressed. The other thing you need to know about emerging drug trends is that even though this particular document is listed as emerging drug trends for 2020, and if you look even closer, it says here, oh, it was actually published in March of this year, so it must be right up to date. And what you'll find as we go through the data, that a lot of the data lags behind by about a year. So what we're talking about is sort of a retrospective examination about these trends. It is very difficult to know exactly what's happening right at this moment because the data just hasn't been accrued yet. And so we're sort of looking at the recent past with most of this data. But it still gives you an idea about what the trends are, what to look for, and what to expect in your particular court. All right, so we're going to start with synthetic cannabinoids. So heretofore, those were listed as spice. You can see spice down here, or K2 or K137 or whatever it's up to now. So synthetic cannabinoids are materials that are not marijuana. They are chemicals that are literally sprayed on dried botanicals. So if you can imagine going out and mowing your grass and collecting the grass clippings and laying them out on your kitchen table and letting them dry and then spraying them with these cannabinoid-like chemicals and then putting it in a little foil pouch and then selling it, essentially that's exactly what's happening in the synthetic cannabinoid industry. So these are not marijuana. These are chemicals that are structured a lot like delta 9 THC, which of course is the active ingredient in marijuana, but it's not marijuana. So if you remember back a few years, when all of these synthetic cannabinoids start to emerge, they had names like HU 210, HU 211. Well, the HU stands for Hebrew University because that was the place where these chemicals were first elucidated and first identified. JWH 018. JWH stands for John W. Huffman, who was actually a researcher at Clemson University who did a lot of research in this area. So, I mean, the names had a relevance to the individuals who were studying them. Then the cart sort of went off the rails, and people were all over the map, all over the world. People were beginning to identify these synthetic cannabinoids, and so they just started arbitrarily giving them names like AKB18, which just happened to be the same name as a popular Japanese girl band. And then another group of researchers labeled some of these synthetic cannabinoids as XLR11, which just happened to be the name of a liquid rocket fuel. And so the scientists in toxicology and pharmacology brought the car back on the rails. And what we do now when we identify most of the recent synthetic cannabinoids is we give them a name that is reflective of their chemical structure. So, for example, one of the synthetic cannabinoids is named Apica, which in fact is the actual chemical formula of the name, and we drop the numbers and the smaller case letters, and simply call it what it is. And then there's Apinaca, for example, which is another abbreviation for the chemical substances. So when you see synthetic cannabinoids labeled now, they aren't labeled like a popular Japanese girl band. They are actually labeled with their chemical name, which is shortened, but links it to the actual chemical constituent. All right, so where are most of these synthetic cannabinoids made? And the answer is Asia. A lot of them come from China, but certainly the whole Asian continent, including Vietnam and India and the Philippines, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the works. All of them are involved in the production of synthetic cannabinoids. And again, remember, these are liquid chemicals that are manufactured to look structurally like marijuana. And then the liquid chemicals are either transshipped as a liquid, or they may actually be sprayed on the dried botanical material overseas and then shipped as a finished product. Now, this is a slide from the DEA, which outlines what the chemical plants look like. And I guess my question is, if you showed this to one of your participants, are they really comfortable putting something into their body that was generated from a plant that looks like this? Obviously, no quality control, no hygiene in terms of its preparation. The only reason these workers are wearing masks is so that they don't become intoxicated by the chemicals via environmental contamination. All right, so let's look at the 10 most frequently reported synthetic cannabinoids in 2019. And again, this is data that was retrieved in July of last year. So it's less than a year old. But again, it takes a while to accrue this data. And this is data that came into the National Forensic Laboratory Information System. And as you can see, one of the particular synthetic cannabinoids was responsible for about a third of all the cannabinoids identified in the United States. And that's the 5-FMDMB pica, which is still, I believe, one of the most popular synthetic cannabinoids out there. The reason I show you this slide is to sort of demonstrate in one sense as to how incredibly difficult it is for laboratories to keep abreast of this data. You know, as soon as a laboratory dedicates some personnel and some instrumentation and some time to identify this variety of chemicals, the landscape changes. One of the words we use in the designer drug world is that it's an evolutionary landscape. Every time a country makes one of these chemicals illegal, anytime the lab tries to figure out what these chemicals are, the manufacturers of these chemicals change the formulation and start producing new substances. One of the things that the National Institutes of Health have done is try through campaigns to make sure that people understand that what's on the label of the package is not always what is in the package when they buy it clandestinely or illicitly. And it's certainly what's in the package is not marijuana. You know, because these things are advertised as synthetic cannabinoids, there are people that go away with the impression that because, oh, they're synthetic cannabinoids, they're not marijuana, they're obviously safer for us to use, when in fact that's exactly the opposite. And as you can see, you have the dried botanicals, the dried plant materials, chemicals are added to them, and that's what's being sold to the general public. And as you can see, the information continues to mount about the potential hazards associated with these chemicals and their unknown effects on the human body. An interesting trend that has occurred over the last decade is that calls into poison control centers about synthetic cannabinoids and the health effects has actually declined. You know, we see this high here in 2000 high. That wasn't meant as a joke. And we see this high here in 2015 of the number of calls into poison control for that year at 7,792. And you can see how dramatically it has fallen in 2019. So the question becomes, what's the explanation for that serious decrease in calls? It could be that there aren't as dramatic effects of the synthetic cannabinoids because the original manufacturer of these chemicals and putting it on the plant materials has learned how to titrate it in such a way so that people get the cannabinoid high that they're used to getting from marijuana, but they don't get all the side effects. So that's one explanation. Manufacturer has learned how to quality control and to manufacture these chemicals so that the side effects, the negative side effects, have been reduced. Quite frankly, the other explanation for the decrease is that people who are users of synthetic cannabinoids now know what to expect. And so the side effects and the expectations from the high of using synthetic cannabinoids is known. It's not unexpected. So there's no reason to call into poison control with the potential adverse side effects. It used to be that the synthetic cannabinoids used to be packaged on dry materials like we've talked about. And now what we're finding as an emerging trends is that these chemicals are now being put into oils so that they can be vaped. So not only do we see the synthetic cannabinoids being smoked in many of the traditional ways, but now the oils of the synthetic cannabinoids are now being made available commercially so that they can be vaped by the end user. not necessarily a advance in technology, and perhaps an actual change in delivery mechanisms may make these things even more dangerous. All right, the second category of designer drugs or in emerging trends is what we call the designer cathinones, the stimulants. So these would be primarily classified as the bath salt types of compounds. And the synthetic cathinones actually come from a plant that is grown in the Horn of Africa. This particular biological plant is called khat. And if any of you saw the movie where the ship was kidnapped by I think it was Sudanese pirates, and they were chewing on a weed. It was Captain Phillips, I think, was the name of the film, and they were chewing on these plants. And the bottom line is that they were chewing on the stems of khat plants. And the reason they were acting so freaking crazy was that the cathinone in these khat plants is a major psychoactive ingredient. And so the reason that they were acting so bizarrely in the Captain Phillips movie was because they were chewing on these khat plants. Well, I mean, the feds understood way early on that this was a dangerous plant, and so the actual plant material was banned in by the DEA in 1933, and it was first identified as a psychoactive ingredient back in 1929. Well, you have to understand the designer chemists. You know, they're not fools, they're not idiots. So what they did, rather than to stick with the cathinone, what they did was they added 2 methyl groups onto the cathinone. That's what designer chemists do. That's how they manipulate the molecule. They change the key just a little bit. Methyl methcathinone, which is the designer drug, is still a psychoactive agent, but they change the key, they change the chemical structure so that it's no longer illegal. So methyl methcathinone and all the bath salts have amphetamine-like properties. They're very powerful synthetic stimulants. They have absolutely no medical value, and so they have adverse medical and adverse psychiatric ramifications from using them. The most popular, as we'll see in a minute, the most popular bath salt now is eutalone, followed by benzalone. And it comes in a variety of approaches. This document is from about a year old. Here you can see these bath salts in a pill form. Again, we're looking at eutalone, and of course, the international community is talking about how dangerous they are in terms of their association with different types of adverse conditions, medical conditions. So here's again a pie chart of the 10 most frequently reported synthetic cathinones. Again, these are the bath salts, and eutalone is obviously almost 2/3 of all of the bath salts that are seized and identified by the National Forensic Laboratories. And this data was updated in July of 2020. So you've got the 2 designer categories that we've already addressed. You've got the synthetic cannabinoids and the bath salts, so we'll move on now to these designer synthetic opioids. So this is be the 3rd designer drug category that causes problems, well, nationally and internationally. And of course, as we have identified over the last several years, the biggest problem, the biggest synthetic opiate that we confront is the fentanyls. And the problem here is that a lot of the designer drugs that are being clandestinely manufactured, and the ones that are being sold on the streets of this country are not necessarily the medicinal fentanyl. There are a lot of fentanyls that have been, again, chemically altered so that they may not violate current controlled substance laws or current prohibitions that have been established by legal efforts. And so, you see fentanyls in New Jersey look like this. You see fentanyls in Texas, which are actually nose sprays. So they're given intranasally. You have a black tar like fentanyl that's in California, that can be melted and injected IV, or it can be melted and vaped. And then again, you have acetyl fentanyl that's out of Nebraska that actually looks like blotter acid. These are actually little squares of blotter material where the liquid fentanyl is placed on the blotter and then used in a variety of mechanisms to enter the body. And it doesn't take a rocket science to understand the fentanyl popularity in the US population. Again, this is data that comes to us from the National Forensic Laboratory Information System. This is data that was updated again a little less than a year ago. But again, it doesn't take a genius to figure out how the incidence of identifications of fentanyl have skyrocketed in recent years. And it is absolutely the number one substance of abuse that is identified within the synthetic opiate category. Here's a scary situation where this slide illustrates counterfeit oxycodone tablets, but that actually contain at least some fentanyl in the tablet. And one of the reasons that I point this out is that your participants may be buying a substance that they think is one chemical, but because it's counterfeit, it may have ingredients in it or chemicals in it that they don't expect. So for purchasing illicit drugs on the street or from clandestine marketers is not like going to the pharmacy where you get a prescription for 20 milligrams of drug X, and because you're buying it from a known source, you know that it is 20 milligrams of drug X. When you buy things on the street, it could be 20 milligrams of drug X or 1,000 milligrams of drug X, and it may have other chemicals in it besides that. So, I mean, when your clients take these clandestine and illicitly produced medications, it's chemical roulette. They don't ever really know what it is that there is in these chemical compounds. All right, now I'm going to give you some really up-to-date data. And the next slide is going to be incredibly busy, but I'm going to walk through it with you step by step. So this is from the fourth quarter of 2020. So this is data that has actually been accrued very recently in terms of our understanding. Okay, so here's this really busy slide. So let's go through them the same way we did before. Okay, the synthetic cannabinoids. During this period, during this 3-month period, during the last quarter of 2020, they identified 8 synthetic cannabinoids. So of all the cannabinoids identified in the fourth quarter of 2020, there were 8 that were identified. And now the new synthetic cannabinoid that's sort of the leader of the pack, if you will, is a slight modification of the one we talked about earlier. It's still the MDMB, but it's now a de-energized Pinaka. And so it's slightly, again, chemically modified, and that's the one that's number one on the market now. And you can see how a lab trying to keep up with this has to be really on their toes to be able to identify all the new varieties. If there is a silver lining in this data, is that no new synthetic cannabinoids were identified and reported in this quarter. So that's some good news. Okay, with regards to the synthetic opiates, there were 483 identifications, but as you can see, almost all of them, the vast majority of them, 442, were fentanyl. Again, there's good news in here that there were not a lot of alternative fentanyls. So the carfentanyls, the acetyl fentanyls, the dyspropionyl p-fluoryl fentanyls. So I mean, there weren't a lot of new ones of those. These are single events of each one of these. And if there's again a silver lining in the fourth quarter, no new synthetic opiates were reported in that quarter. So fentanyl seems to be the synthetic cannabinoid, synthetic opiate that is most on the market. The bath salts, the cathinones, 13 were identified, and out of the 13, 11 were the utilones. So that's another marketplace that seems to have settled down. And is somewhat predictable, at least at this stage. And once again, in the fourth quarter, no new cathinones were identified. There's some designer benzodiazepines out there. There were 55 identified, and you can see atizolam was the most prevalent. And these are other benzodiazepines that have been chemically modified from their original manufacturer, like clonazepam or alprazolam, so Xanax and things like that. Once again, interestingly enough, there were no new synthetic benzodiazepines in the fourth quarter of last year. So again, state is very, very busy, but it gives you a sense as to how things are evolving, what the trends really are. The trends seem to be somewhat stable. Utilone in the bath salts, fentanyl in the synthetic opioids, and etizolam has really been stable in the benzodiazepines for some time. All right, so drug testing for designer drugs or novel or new psychoactive substances. From a treatment court perspective, it is challenging, but not impossible. There are laboratories out there that specialize in designer drugs or new psychoactive substances. I'm not for a second suggesting that you test your entire population for these. What I am suggesting is that you target people where you may have subjective information that they're using some of these designer drugs or these new psychoactive substances. And you get maybe subjective information from other participants, from family members, from non-compliant behavior in other areas of the court, that sort of thing. So rather than using your standardized drug test, which may be an 8-panel or a 10-panel or a 14-panel or whatever it is, maybe you choose to target some people that you're suspicious of. This slide also serves to remind you that current THC technologies, methodologies in your normal or routine 8-panel drug test or 10-panel drug test that test for cannabinoids is not effective. It will not identify synthetic cannabinoids, the spice and K2 varieties that we've talked about. There are new immunoassays being brought to the market for screening for some of these synthetic cannabinoids. Check with your laboratory to see if they have availability to those new screening assays for designer drugs or novel psychoactive compounds. I urge your caution for using on-site devices for the detection of designer drugs or synthetic cannabinoids or synthetic cathinones, the bath salts. Generally speaking, the on-site devices, because it's an evolutionary landscape, these on-site devices just can't keep pace. It takes them 6 months, 8 months to develop a product and get it to market. And by the time it gets to market, the compound that they developed the test for is no longer being used. The illicit chemists have moved on to a new compound, and so the on-site devices for designer drugs or NPS compounds generally lags behind and will give you lots of false negatives. Use a reference lab with a known track record for identifying and keeping up with the trends associated with designer drugs or new psychoactive substances. I recommend using a laboratory that's using liquid chromatography tandem mass spectrometry. That's the technology that is most often used for testing of these types of synthetic materials and clandestinely made drugs. Understand that it is an evolutionary landscape. These chemical compounds change, and so this increases the risk of false negatives. Despite these limitations, I encourage laboratory to drug test for these new psychoactive substances. Clients need to know that the treatment court is attempting to identify these things, maybe to act as a potential deterrent. Drug courts know how to respond. We know how to do this. So even though these novel psychoactive substances and these designer drugs may be present within our participant population, we know how to respond to this, even if we can't test our way out of the problem. So the first thing we need to do is we need to acknowledge the situation. We need to ban designer drugs and novel psychoactive substances. We need to put that ban in writing in the drug court contract, in the treatment court handbook. We need to drug test on a selected basis for these new novel substances. And we need to use community supervision to determine whether or not these substances are being used by the population that we're supervising. You know, community supervision should do frequent, random, announced and unannounced visits during non-governmental hours. They should use, if your clients have signed a Fourth Amendment waiver, they need to use the power of search and seizure to determine whether or not any of your clients have these compounds in their presence. And for testing purposes, select participants for testing where there are indications of use. Identify positive participants for designer drugs in court and sanction openly to enhance the deterrent effect. And many courts actually during this event where designer drugs are being identified to the court population, they provide an opportunity for participants to self-report. We know that self-reporting is therapeutic progress. Now, are we holding a sickle over their throat in order to self-report? Yeah, maybe we are. But self-reporting is therapeutic progress. And anytime we can get a participant to identify that they're using any drug, but particularly drugs that are hard to test for, that's certainly advantageous to a recovery process. All right. So now we're going to change focus. 180 degrees, well, maybe only 120 degrees. And we're going to talk about the intersection of cannabidiols, CBD, and therapeutic courts. So just to remind everybody how similar structurally chemical, even though I hate to put up chemical formulas on the screen, I want everybody to see how closely related the chemical structure of tetrahydrocannabinol, the primary psychoactive ingredient of marijuana, is to CBD. And basically we're exchanging this oxygen for this hydroxyl group over here, and that's the only difference. The rest of the molecule is exactly the same. All right, little history lesson. Marijuana, cannabis, has been cultivated for thousands of years. And it has been identified in papyrus writings and in scrolls that date back to 1400 to 2000 BC. Okay, before the Common Era. Maybe I should have labeled that BCE. In the 19th century, marijuana was considered valuable for some medicinal usage. But in 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act. And then in 1969, that act was ruled unconstitutional. In other words, this actually legalized some use of marijuana. But in 1969, the Marijuana Tax Act was ruled unconstitutional. And then shortly ever after, marijuana was criminalized. And it remains criminalized today. It is a Schedule I drug. Now, we can argue about whether or not that's appropriate, but from a legal perspective, marijuana is still a Schedule I drug. All right, how about a little CBD history lesson? CBD as a breakdown product or as a chemical reformulation of delta-9 THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, was first elucidated in 1940. So it's relatively recent. And understand that CBD is just one of hundreds of cannabinoids that have been identified from cannabis or marijuana. In 1946, so just 6 years later, studies in lab animals demonstrated that CBD did not cause an altered mental state. So they classified it as CBD as a non-psychoactive compound. But the actual chemical formulation and what it looks like was not really enlightened until 1963. So CBD has a very, very recent history when compared to traditional marijuana. All right, in terms of CBD legal milestones, it was in 2018, so we're just talking a couple of years ago, that Congress passed the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, otherwise known as the Farm Bill. And this act was to legalize the production of hemp, that farmers in the United States could go out and grow hemp as a crop, as a legally produced crop, in order to make, in most cases, rope or hemp-related products. But as part of the Farm Bill, it also essentially legalized or lifted the ban on hemp as long as it didn't contain more than 0.3% THC. Now, I want you to remember that fact because that's going to be really important later on. So it's legal now to produce hemp. It's legal to produce hemp as long as it doesn't contain a 0.3% THC or delta-9 THC, the psychoactive ingredient. But it's not legal to produce CBD from marijuana. Okay, you can only produce CBD from hemp legally. All right. So that gives us sort of a platform. Just so we're clear on this 0.3%, the production of CBD, even though it's legal, is largely unregulated. In other words, nobody from the federal government or the Food and Drug Administration or the CBD cops, I don't know that there are any, actually go out and ensure the purity of the CBD to make sure that it is not above this 0.3% THC. So the products that are sold in dispensaries and from any other manner of commercial entity, including all of those on the internet, even though they advertise the product as 100% pure THC, a pure CBD, even though they advertise that it's 100% CBD, even though they advertise that it has less than 0.3% THC, there is absolutely no guarantee that's true. Now, I have seen on the internet that some of these sellers of CBD actually say, oh, we will send you a LCMS characterization of our product or a GCMS analysis of our product. You know, you have no way of knowing whether that's legitimate or not. So the take-home message is that the CBD material that is being purchased by your participants, there is no way to determine what the purity of that material is, and there's no way to determine that it is less than 0.3% THC. So when they come to you and they say, "Oh, but I'm only using a pure CBD product. I'm only using a CBD product that has been certified," not going to even show you the paper of the lab analysis that did. There is absolutely no way. There's no guarantee that that's legitimate. As an example, here's a SAMHSA memo that was published recently, where SAMHSA hired some people to go and study the CBD. They tested 84 different CBD products, okay? And they found that 69% of those, the amount of THC in the CBD product was inconsistent with what was on the label, and that it was less than 0.3%. In fact, so you have these products, 69% of the products that were tested had unlabeled cannabinoids in them. Now think about that in a minute. Unlabeled cannabinoids that may turn a screening test positive. Okay, so keep that in mind. And THC in amounts of up to 6.4 milligrams per milliliter. So, I mean, what this tells you is that the products being sold out there, you cannot trust that there aren't unlabeled cannabinoids in them, and that the amount of THC is considerably higher than that 0.3%. Now, since the Agricultural Act of 2018 and the legalization of the growing of hemp, and ultimately the legalization of the manufacture of CBD, it has become wildly popular. But let me tell you, it is not a miracle cure. The actual research about the health benefits of CBD is scant. I mean, but that doesn't stop people from advertising that it, I mean, look at these things it supposedly cures. It supposedly cures acne. I love that it cures addiction. So all of your participants should be using CBD since it cures addiction. It cures anorexia. It cures Alzheimer's disease. Motion sickness, mood disorders, schizophrenia. I'm surprised hangnails isn't on here as something that it cures. So people are going to walk into your office and they're going to have a piece of paper and they're going to, well, I'm taking CBD because I have PTSD from some former trauma, and it's really helping me with my PTSD. And you look at them and, yet another person who's been convinced that it cures everything up to including, yes, my particular favorite, mad cow disease. Okay. So you've got all of these claims that CBD does all these miracle cures when in fact there's no scientific evidence that it does in fact do this. So that's one problem of using CBD in a treatment course. Here's another problem. CBD has known interactions with psychotropic drugs that may be being used to help alleviate the symptoms associated with co-occurring disorders. So if you have any participants who are on Zoloft, which is sertraline, CBD is known to interact negatively with that medication. CBD is known to react and interact with SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, most of which are antidepressants, which may be being used by people in your court associated with co-occurring disorders. CBD is known to cause a drop in blood pressure. CBD is known to increase the side effects of benzodiazepines. You may have some participants who are taking benzodiazepines as a medication to help alleviate some of the symptoms of co-occurring disorders. We know that CBD has a known interaction to increase the side effects of benzodiazepines, and CBD is known to increase blood concentrations of some heart medications. So not only do we have all of the claims that CBD doesn't, all of the diseases that CBD doesn't cure, now we have scientific data that tells us that CBD interacts negatively with some of the medications that some of our participants are taking. All right. So in a treatment court abstinence monitoring program, how do we treat CBD? Where do we go from here in terms of CBD use in an abstinence monitoring situation? All right. Key component number 5 of drug courts is that abstinence is monitored by frequent alcohol and other drug testing. So the question becomes, does the use of CBD complicate the court's ability to successfully perform routine drug testing, which is designed to monitor your participants' compliance, okay, with the banned substance listed in your court, and to ensure that they are that the court is monitoring abstinence, which is going to promote recovery. Okay. Just as a way of reviewing, we know that most of our drug testing is a 2-step approach. So we start out right with a screening test, which is designed to separate drugs into 2 major categories, right? Drugs that don't interact with the tests, so they're negative. And those drugs that interact, there's some reaction with the screening test, which are identified as presumptively positive. They interacted with the screening test in some way, so it's suggestive that one of the banned substances is indeed present in the sample that we're testing. Well, in order to ensure that we meet due process standards of the court, and to ensure that we're sanctioning somebody that is indeed has violated the rules against prohibited substance, we often perform a confirmation test. So the confirmation test is not repeating the screening test. The confirmation test is using a methodologically different test in order to confirm, to authenticate, to validate the results of the screening test. So it's a different analytical technique. It's not just repeating the screening test. And generally speaking, the confirmation test using GCMS or using LC tandem MS is more selective and more sensitive than the screening test. Okay. Why is it again we're confirming? Why can't we just use that screening test to adjudicate the cases in front of us? Well, we can, if in fact we confront the client or the participant with the positive results of the screening test and they self-report. Okay, that's confirmation. You don't have to send it off for GCMS or LCMS to get confirmation. If they self-report to the drug that was identified in the screening test, okay, fine. That's confirmation. But we also know that some screening tests have the potential to identify a compound that is not of interest, that's not a target compound, that's not a substance of abuse. And so we know screening tests have the potential to produce false positive results. And that's why we do confirmation. It's a due process requirement if the client does not self-report, because we don't want to sanction someone for a false positive result. Okay, think about this a minute. The most likely encounter of a false positive report is if the molecules that we're testing for look like, are chemically structured like the compounds that we're actually testing for. Remember this slide right here? remember how much cannabidiol looks like THC. Is it possible that if a cannabidiol preparation that's been bought from a dirty gas station somewhere on the interstate and doesn't actually contain 0.3% or less of THC, has more THC, might cross-react with our screening test? What if that cannabidiol that was purchased online from some irreputable dealer and sent to you participant that contains other cannabinoids not identified? Is it possible it could be testing positive by your screening test? And the answer to that is yes. And so that's the concern in a treatment court environment. The cross-reactivity of CBD and most of its breakdown products toward initial screens, instrumented and on-site devices, is significantly understudied. Therefore, the potential for false positive cannabinoid results may be problematic in a treatment court with participants who are using CBD related products. So here's a possible scenario. So the court participant is using CBD. Okay, we don't know where the heck they got it. Maybe from that dirty gas station by the internet, maybe or by the interstate, maybe from an internet vendor of some kind. Okay, so the client tests positive on the initial screen, again, whether it's instrumented in a laboratory or a benchtop analyzer that you have in the court, or maybe an on-site device, a test cup or an instant read device of some kind. They test positive for cannabinoids on this initial screen. They deny the use of marijuana. So now you're going to be sending that initial screen or the urine sample or whatever sample it is from that initial positive screen to a laboratory for confirmation. Okay, let's see what the next slide. Okay, all right. So it goes to the laboratory for confirmation, and the laboratory is generally going to use GCMS or LC Tandem MS as their screening technique. Gold standard, 99.9% accurate. They identify chemicals based on their chemical fingerprint. So great technologies. But what are they looking for when you're doing a confirmation for marijuana, for cannabinoids? They're looking for the marijuana metabolite. They're looking for the drug that's produced after someone has smoked marijuana. They're looking for this chemical, carboxy acid THC. That's what they're looking for when they're attempting to confirm the illegal use of marijuana by one of your clients. Guess what? CBD does not produce that metabolite. So now what do you got? You've got a positive screening test because of the impurity of the CBD that your client is taking. So you've got a legitimate positive screening test, and now you've got a negative confirmation test because your lab is looking for this. It's looking for the marijuana metabolite. It's not looking for the CBD stuff. Carboxy THC, the metabolite of marijuana, is not a metabolite of CBD. So the confirmation results are going to come back as negative, and now you're faced with a discrepancy in testing. Positive screening test, negative confirmation. All right, let's go back to key component number 5. Abstinence monitoring by frequent alcohol and other test time. If the court's primary role in participant supervision is an effort to produce long-term, how does it to promote excuse me, I made a obvious error. It's really hard to do. Anyway, long-term recovery from substance abuse. The court is obligated to monitor the client for abstinence, right? That's the goal. That's one of the key components of a treatment court. So if the court is unable to monitor a client for the abstinence of marijuana, if CBD is being used, what options does the court have? Essentially, what CBD has done, because you get the positive screening test and the negative confirmation test, essentially what that CBD use has done is it's obfuscated your ability to accurately interpret the results of your abstinence monitoring. It has interfered with your ability to evaluate the results of a drug test. And so that kind of puts your abstinence monitoring strategy in the trash can. Okay, what does the court do with other substances that interfere with the court's ability to accurate and reliably interpret drug testing results? What do? We ban these substances, don't we? We ban alcohol. It's a legal substance, but we ban it because it interferes with our ability to evaluate the results of a drug test. We ban products that contain alcohol for that very reason. What else do we ban? We ban poppy seeds because they might interfere with our opiate assay. It might interfere and produce a positive opiate result when in fact the individual hasn't relapsed. He or she may be ate a poppy seed bagel. We ban creatine because it changes and artificially elevates urine creatinine and may obfuscate our ability to detect when a sample is dilute. We ban alcohol containing medicines, and maybe we ban dietary supplements and energy drinks and homeopathic powders or anything not regulated by the FDA. The point of this slide is to illustrate that the court bans. We're in a supervisory role, and so we have the power to ban things that are going to interfere with our ability to evaluate the results of a drug test. So ding, 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 ding. How is the court going to respond to CBD? If a substance interferes with the court's ability to accurately, reliably evaluate the drug testing results in order to ensure client behavior, they should be restricted from use by the participant population. Bottom line, treatment courts should prohibit the use of any materials. So that would include chemicals, ingestibles, drugs, non-medicinal products, all of those, energy drinks and supplements and whatever, non-FDA approved supplements, etc. This list could go on, that have the potential to interfere with the court's ability to accurately, reliably evaluate or interpret the results of abstinence monitoring testing. So that would include CBD. Unless that material, that chemical, that drug, that ingestible has been legally prescribed by a licensed physician. Now, I hear what some of you are saying, but I have a doctor who says my participant should take CBD because it helps his PTSD. Let's talk about the Controlled Substance Act. Controlled Substance Act is a provision in law that classifies potentially habituating chemicals, drugs, medicines in 5 categories. Any use of a scheduled drug requires a medical prescription. CBD is not a scheduled drug. So two possibilities. The CBD is being used without medical advice, or the CBD product is being used with medical advice. Well, if it's not being used with medical advice, we can, as supervisors in the court, we can handle that. But if there's a physician or a psychologist or some person that is guiding or helping our participant and encouraging our participant to use CBD, then the problem gets a little stickier. CBD use without medical advice should be prohibited. So essentially we're crossing out that possibility. Medical prescription for CBD is likely inappropriate since CBD, there's not any research to support its use in many categories. And there is also recommendations from the Annals of Internal Medicine, which I can provide anybody if they want, that CBD is detrimental for use in with mental health cases. CBD that occurs with medical advice should be carefully scrutinized. You need to get a waiver from the physician or the psychologist, whoever is prescribing it. And you need to talk to the prescriber, whoever that is, so that they understand the role of the court in supervising this participant in order to promote recovery. You're both doing the same thing, right? You're trying to save this person's life. But in many cases, the prescriber, the physician or the psychologist, whoever is encouraging this person to use CBD, may not understand that this individual is in a court supervised program for addiction. So you need to reach out to that prescriber and get them involved in the process. Don't let them become a codependent. Can a physician write a prescription for CBD? The legality of that is unclear and is legally contested, and so you may want to get some of your court attorneys involved in that. But for CBD, the physicians don't often write a prescription. What they do is they suggest, or they advise, or they urge, or they recommend that treatment. And that's when you get into the discourse with the physician to say, okay, if you can show me a scientific study that says CBD will in fact cure hangnails, and that's why you prescribed it, that's the kind of information that the court needs to say, okay, we aren't going to practice medicine. That's illegal. Okay. But hold that physician's feet to the fire. Some states, a physician can write a prescription for CBD if it's for a qualifying medical condition. So then the onus is on that physician to tell the court, hey, this meets the requirement for my prescription for CBD. Does the physician know that the patient, his or her patient, is in fact also a client of a substance recovery program? That information may be crucial and unknown to the prescriber, and should be. So you could steal this verbiage word for word if you want, put into your client contract the use of potentially habituating medications or substances with the potential to interfere with the court's ability to accurately, reliably evaluate abstinence monitoring strategies, such as drug testing, are expressly prohibited without a specific prescription from a licensed physician or other licensed healthcare professional. And then healthcare people who are advising or urging or suggesting that somebody take CBD, no. It has to be a written prescription, not advice, not encouragement, not suggestions, a prescription. And so essentially what you're doing is you're effectively practically banning the use of CBD in your treatment court. All right. What about medical marijuana? Medical marijuana is pretty much illegal lots of places now. So you'll see the title is exactly the same. The intersection of medical marijuana and treatment courts. And there's a lot that's going to happen in the next few slides that's going to look awfully familiar. Marijuana, unlike CBD, is a scheduled drug. It is a Schedule I drug. And as a result, it cannot even be legally prescribed by a licensed healthcare person. It is illegal for a physician to prescribe a Schedule I drug, in this case, marijuana. Again, what happens is that the healthcare professional recommends, suggests, urges, whatever, the client to issue some sort of medical memo or recommendation, so that recommendation passes muster at a dispensary. And so the dispensary will then feel like they are obligated or not encumbered in order to provide a prescription or to provide the medical marijuana based on the recommendation of the physician. A review of the medical literature indicates that research on medical marijuana's effectiveness for the treatment of any number of illnesses is at best mixed and is mostly anecdotal. But regardless of that, a licensed physician cannot write a prescription for medical marijuana. Cannabis is a psychoactive drug. Do you really want to introduce a psychoactive drug into a treatment regime which includes medications designed to promote recovery that also have psychoactive effects? The use of a psychoactive drug, marijuana, with unproven benefits and known habituating issues in a dependency court seems to me to be an anathema. These things seem to be incompatible. The potential for cannabis or marijuana being used along with other psychoactive drugs and have negative implications is pretty significant. And so you see, so again, you have that same problem that you have with CBD. You have interaction with medications designed to promote recovery and to diminish the effects of mental illness, while at the same time interfering with the court's ability to abstinence monitor. So, what do? You'll recall this slide. Treatment courts should prohibit the use of any materials, chemicals, ingestibles, drugs, non-medical products, non-FDA approved supplements, etc., that have the potential to interfere with the court's ability to accurately and reliably evaluate or interpret the results of abstinence monitoring testing, unless that material has been legally prescribed by a licensed physician. And we already know that medical marijuana cannot be legally prescribed because it is a Schedule I drug. Problem solved. Recovery is tough enough. Recovery is tough enough without adding the problems associated with CBD and medical marijuana to the equation. Do what you can to restrict or ban the use of both of those substances, and it will help your patients, your clients, your participants in their road to recovery. We don't want to make it any tougher for them. They've already got a long haul in front of them. Let's at least remove the obstacles for them to achieve recovery. With some fear, I give you my email address, knowing that this presentation probably raised a lot of questions, concerns, arguments, debate, whatever. And so I give you my email address in order for you to have a channel, a route, a venue to send me questions. I try fairly diligently to answer the questions that are sent to me and give you my best advice. If I don't know the answer to the questions or it's not appropriate for me to answer the questions, sometimes I get medical questions. I'm not a physician. And so I don't engage in answering medical questions. I'm not an attorney. So I try to avoid and dissuade people from asking me legal questions. But if the questions involve drug testing and abstinence monitoring via drug testing, I will do my best to answer those. I thank all of you for attending today. I really appreciate your attendance. I know that attending Zoom conferences sometimes is not as valuable as doing it in person, but I really do appreciate your attendance. I encourage you to mask up. I encourage you to get your vaccines. I've gotten both of my Moderna shots. I'm going on Friday for a haircut. I'm very excited about that. Just want to let you know all that. But again, thank you for your attendance.
And thank you, Paul, very much. It's been a great afternoon of hearing from you. If you have questions, you need to email him. He's not going to have time to respond to those. We're 4 minutes to 4, and I have a couple things to share with you before we sign off. So please feel free to use his email address. As I mentioned previously, he's pretty good about responding, actually. So he's not one of those that when you email, it will end up in the abyss. So a couple housekeeping things. We have our Remo site is up until 5 o'clock Central Time. So if you are wanting to do some networking and chill out with each other, please go check that out right after this session in just a few minutes. If you are interested in going and learning who the faith-based coordinators and Lifeline coordinators are in your area, please go to Remo on the 4th floor and look for Diane Sharon. She will, I think Diane told me, and they will help you identify your regional folks in case you don't know who those folks are. And last but not least, I don't know if you had a chance to see that in the opening remarks, we have Carolyn Harden and the governor is going to come and say hello to you in the morning. So make sure that you are there at 9 o'clock Central Time in the morning. Look forward to seeing everybody there. Again, thank you, Paul, so much. We appreciate it. And you guys have a great afternoon.